The freak wave struck at 3:41 a.m., 11 minutes into the engagement, while SM-2 Cell 14 was in flight and ESSM Cell 7 was computing its terminal intercept solution, and the weapons officer's thumb was on the authorization panel for Cell 8. What the ship's crew called a freak wave and what oceanographers called a rogue wave were the same physical event. A wave significantly larger than the surrounding sea state, formed when multiple smaller wave trains intersect and their energies superimpose, producing a wall of water that can reach 2 to 3 times the significant wave height of the surrounding sea. In Beaufort, 9 conditions, sustained winds at 41 to 47 knots, significant wave height 4.0 to 5.5 meters. The surrounding sea was already extreme. The wave that struck at 3:41 a.m. was measured afterward by the ship's motion reference unit at 11.2 meters in height. In a sea state whose characteristic waves were 4.5 meters, an 11.2 meter wave was not merely large. It was a different physical category. The destroyer is operating in the North Pacific, 440 nautical miles west of the Aleutian Islands, in transit from a port visit in Japan to a patrol station in the Bering Sea. The transit corridor passes through one of the most consistently severe open ocean environments on Earth. The crew had been managing Beaufort 9 conditions for 14 hours before the engagement began and would manage them for another 22 hours before conditions moderated. The flight deck had been closed for 16 hours. The Seahawk was secured in its hangar, with all deck tie-downs deployed. Weather decks had been cleared of personnel since 2 a.m. At 3:30 a.m., the SPY-6, in its degraded sea state mode, resolved 40 airborne contacts, bearing 295 to 318, range 68 to 74 kilometers, altitude 350 to 500 meters, speed 190 kilometers per hour. 3 groups of approximately 13 to 14 platforms each, consistent with Shahed-136 one-way attack platform profiles, approaching from the northwest. The weather was not their friend. In Beaufort 9 conditions, the SPY-6 surface mode clutter suppression was consuming significant processor capacity, and the air search mode performance was degraded by the sea spray loading on the radar's dome surface, which reduced antenna gain by approximately 6 to 8% from its rated specification. The ESSM semi-active illuminator was operating in a sea state compensated mode that adjusted the illuminator beam for the ship's pitch and roll cycle. In 14 hours of Beaufort, 9 seas, the ship's pitch cycle had been between 8 and 12 degrees at a 9 to 11 second period. An 8 to 12 degree pitch cycle meant the ESSM illuminator was pointing 8 to 12 degrees off the target, bearing for 1 to 2 seconds out of every 9 to 11 second pitch period. The same limitation that had affected the Arctic engagement applied here in its North Pacific variant. The ESSM hit probability in Beaufort 9 was estimated at 65 to 70%, down from the standard 82 to 86%. The TAO read the contact picture at 3:30 a.m. and made his engagement plan with the Beaufort 9 degradations applied across all systems. He had done this before. The numbers were tighter than standard, but workable. 40 contacts, SM-6 outer ring at reasonable probability, SM-2 and ESSM middle rings at degraded probability, CIWS inner ring with the barrel elevation and spray contamination problems documented in every Arctic engagement. A standard engagement with weather penalties applied. What he had not applied was a rogue wave probability factor, because rogue wave probability factors were not part of any engagement planning document he had ever read. Running count, 3:30 a.m., second 040. UAV contacts bearing 295 to 318, range 68 to 74 kilometers, 190 kilometers per hour, altitude 350 to 500 meters. Sea state, Beaufort 9, wave height 4.0 to 5.5 meters, pitch cycle 8 to 12 degrees, SPY 6, 7% gain degradation. ESSM hit probability, estimated 68%. SM 6-8, SM2 24, ESSM 32, RAM 21, CIWS 100%. Time to SM6 range 9 minutes. Cost $0. SM6 cells 1 through 4 launched at 3:38 a.m. against 4 lead contacts at 66 to 70 kilometers. Standard outer ring engagement. The Beaufort 9 conditions did not substantially affect the SM6's performance. The SM6 used an active radar seeker in terminal phase that was less dependent on the ship's illuminator and less affected by the sea state clutter at the ranges where SM6 engaged. 3 intercepts, 1 miss. SM6 hit rate at 75% in degraded conditions, within expected range for Beaufort 9, 37 contacts remaining. SM6 cells 5 and 6 against 2 more contacts at 62 and 64 kilometers. 2 intercepts, 35 remaining. SM2 cells 1 through 12 fired against 12 contacts at 38 to 50 kilometers. 8 intercepts, 4 misses. The degraded ESSM hit probability had been the weather worry, but SM2 also suffered from the pitch cycle limitation on the fire control illuminator. The semi-active guidance was operating in the same sea state compensated mode. 27 contacts remaining. SM2 cells 13 through 18 against 6 contacts at 28 to 35 kilometers. 4 intercepts, 2 misses. 23 contacts remaining. ESSM range. At 3:41 a.m., 11 minutes into the engagement, with ESSM cells 1 through 7 in various phases of launch preparation, and SM2 cell 14 in flight toward a contact at 31 kilometers, the ship's motion reference unit recorded a roll event outside all parameters of the previous 14 hours. The rogue wave arrived on the port beam at 3:41 a.m. plus 18 seconds. The ship was in a standard 9-degree starboard roll recovery when the wave struck. The wave height as it arrived at the hull was not 11.2 meters at its peak. It had begun to break at that height approximately 400 meters from the ship, and what struck the hull was a steep 7 to 8 meter face of breaking water, moving at approximately 6 meters per second. The ship rolled to 43 degrees port in 4.1 seconds. A destroyer is designed to survive roll angles up to 50 degrees and to self-right from any roll angle up to its stability limit. The ship did not exceed its stability limit. It did not capsize. What happened in the 4.1 seconds of the 43-degree roll and the subsequent 8.7 seconds of recovery was the following. The weapons officer's authorization hand came off the panel as he braced against the console. ESSM Cell 8 did not launch. The authorization had not been completed when the roll interrupted it. The CIWS forward mount, which had been in tracking mode facing bearing 305, had its autogyro stabilization system register the 43-degree roll as outside the stabilization range and enter a safehold mode. The mount secured itself. The tracking data from the 3 seconds before the safehold was stored. The SM2 Cell 14 in flight continued its guidance unaffected. The round was airborne and independent of the ship's motion. 3 consoles in CIC suffered loose equipment impacts as material that had been secured for heavy weather was dislodged by the sudden acceleration. 1 monitor displaying the contact management picture went dark for 7 seconds before its backup power path restored it. The fire control system continued operating. The Aegis hardware was shock-mounted, and the roll event, while severe, did not exceed the system's structural design tolerances. What had changed at 3:41 a.m. plus 22 seconds when the roll began its recovery. ESSM Cell 8 had not launched. The CIWS forward was in safehold. The contact management display had been dark for 7 seconds. And the weapons officer, who was the human authorization node for every ESSM and RAM launch, had his hands on the console frame rather than the authorization panel. The contacts had continued closing during the 4.1-second roll and the 8.7-second recovery. In 12.8 seconds at 190 kilometers per hour, the lead contacts had closed 674 meters. Not a significant closure distance in the engagement's outer timeline, but ESSM Cell 8 had not launched. The contact that ESSM Cell 8 had been tasked to engage was still inbound, now 600 meters closer than planned. Running count: 3:41 a.m., second 674, rogue wave impact. Ship rolled to 43 degrees port, recovering. ESSM Cell 8, authorization interrupted, not launched. CIWS forward, safehold mode. SM2 Cell 14, in flight, unaffected. 23 contacts at 16 to 24 kilometers. SM6, 2 remaining. SM2, 6 remaining. ESSM, 25 remaining, 7 fired, 1 not launched. Cost, $21.6 million. Time, 11 minutes. The CIWS forward safehold released at 3:41 a.m. plus 31 seconds. The autogyro had reacquired its reference, and the mount returned to tracking mode, acquiring the contact picture from the stored pre-safehold data. 13 seconds of tracking interruption. The contacts had moved. The tracking system required 8 additional seconds to recorrelate the stored data with the updated radar positions and produce engagement quality track files. 21 seconds from rogue wave impact to restored CIWS forward tracking capability. The weapons officer had regained his station at 3:41 a.m. plus 27 seconds. He looked at the ESSM Cell 8 authorization panel and saw the interrupted launch status. He authorized Cell 8 manually. The ESSM launched. The contact that ESSM Cell 8 had been tasked to engage was now at 17.8 kilometers instead of 19.6 kilometers when originally scheduled. The basket placement for the ESSM was computed from the rescheduled contact position. 1 intercept. The engagement continued, but the 21-second disruption had not been neutral. 3 contacts had entered the ESSM engagement window during the disruption. 2 were covered by ESSM cells that had been in flight before the rogue wave. 1, contact 31, bearing 298. Range 18.1 kilometers at the moment the disruption began. Had no interceptor assigned to it. It was 18.1 kilometers when the disruption began. It was 16.4 kilometers when normal engagement operations resumed. The fire control system had not assigned it a new interceptor because the disruption had broken the allocation sequence and the restart had prioritized contacts in the existing queue over contacts that had entered the queue during the disruption. Contact 31 was at 16.4 kilometers with no interceptor assigned. The fire control system flagged it immediately when the allocation restart completed. ESSM Cell 9 assigned, authorized, launched. Intercept at 14.8 kilometers. Contact 31 neutralized. The 21-second disruption had produced 1 missed assignment on 1 contact, which had been caught and resolved by the allocation restart. No contact had gotten through as a direct result of the rogue wave event. But the contact 31 engagement had consumed an ESSM cell in a catch-up mode rather than in the planned engagement sequence, and the barrel-to-target geometry at 14.8 kilometers versus the planned 17-kilometer engagement had reduced the ESSM's intercept probability from an estimated 68 to 72%. These were the second-order effects of the rogue wave. Not catastrophic. Not uncorrectable. Measurable. Running count: 3:43 a.m., second 789, 19 contacts at 10 to 16 kilometers. ESSM, 21 remaining, 9 fired, plus cell, 8 late. CIWS forward, tracking restored. SM2, 6. SM6, 2. RAM, 21. CIWS, 100% both mounts. Rogue wave effects: 1 delayed ESSM, 1 catch-up engagement. CIWS forward, 21 seconds downtime, restored. Cost, $26.7 million. Time, 13 minutes. Running count: 3:44 a.m., second 836, contact 31. Catch-up engagement complete. All allocations restored. 19 contacts at 9 to 16 kilometers. SM6, 2. SM2, 6. ESSM, 20 remaining. RAM, 21. CIWS 4, 100% restored. CIWS aft, 100%. Rogue wave effects resolved. Cost, $30.9 million. Time, 14 minutes. ESSM cells 10 through 20 against 11 contacts at 9 to 14 kilometers. 7 intercepts, 4 misses. The 4 misses were distributed between the sea-state seeker degradation, 2 contacts at sea-skimming altitude where the pitch-degraded illuminator created basket offsets, and 1 miss attributed to the carryover effects of the allocation restart, a contact whose track file quality was still recovering from the 7-second monitor outage had a wider basket placement uncertainty. Running count: 3:45 a.m., second 924, SM6, 2 remaining, SM2, 6, ESSM 9, RAM 21, CIWS 100%, 8 contacts at 5 to 9 kilometers. All rogue wave effects fully resolved. Beaufort 9 maintained. Cost $36.9 million. Time 15 minutes. The last 2 SM6 cells went against 2 contacts at 13 and 11 kilometers, not at outer ring range where SM6 was designed to operate, but as precision intercepts against the 2 contacts the TAO judged most likely to penetrate the remaining ESSM and RAM layers based on their approach vectors and the residual track quality problems from the disruption. 2 intercepts. SM6 inventory, 0. 8 contacts remaining. ESSM cells, 21 through 28 against 8 contacts at 6 to 9 kilometers. 5 intercepts, 3 misses, 1 direct result of the sea-state degradation on the illuminator. 3 contacts inside 5 kilometers. RAM cells 1 through 6 against 3 contacts at 3.4 to 4.8 kilometers. 2 intercepts, 1 miss. RAM had been performing consistently in this engagement despite the sea state. The passive infrared seeker was less affected by the ship's pitch cycle than the radar-guided systems. 2 contacts inside 3 kilometers. Running count: 3:47 a.m., second 1027, 2 contacts at 2.1 to 2.8 kilometers. ESSM 4 remaining. RAM 15. CIWS 4, 100%. CIWS aft, 100%. SM6 0. SM2, remaining cells held. Beaufort 9 maintained throughout. Cost $38.1 million. Time 17 minutes. Both remaining contacts entered the CIWS engagement zone within 40 seconds of each other. CIWS forward acquired the first contact at 2,600 meters on bearing 301, altitude 320 meters. The pitch cycle at this moment was placing the ship in a 7-degree bow-up attitude that slightly elevated the CIWS barrel's effective depression angle. The barrel elevation adjustment compensated automatically. Burst, 0.8 seconds, 60 rounds. Contact fragmented at 2,200 meters. Warhead initiated in the fragmentation cloud. The pressure event at 2,200 meters, arriving at the hull 6.6 seconds after detonation at the speed of sound across the water, was felt through the hull plating as a sharp, brief impact against the background of the continuous sea noise that had been the ship's environment for 14 hours. The crew had been listening to Beaufort 9 for so long that distinguishing the detonation overpressure from the environmental noise required deliberate attention. CIWS aft acquired the second contact at 2,900 meters on bearing 311, altitude 280 meters. This contact was the sea skimmer variant that had been descending through the approach. The contact had reached 65 meters altitude by the time CIWS aft acquired it. At 65 meters in Beaufort 9 seas, the CIWS tracking radar was intermittently losing the contact return in wavetop clutter between acquisition sweeps. The mount had to reestablish tracking 3 times during the 2,900 to 2,100 meter approach phase. Burst, 1.4 seconds, 105 rounds. Contact fragmented at 2,050 meters. The CIWS aft's barrel had been depressed to 4 degrees above horizontal to engage the contact, within specifications, but at the lower end of the system's preferred engagement geometry for horizontal targets. The fragmentation pattern was slightly wider than optimal due to the geometric compression at shallow depression angle. Warhead initiated in the fragmentation cloud. Fragments reached the hull, 7 documented impacts on the starboard side above the waterline. None structural. All 40 contacts were neutralized at 3:49 a.m. Running count, 3:49 a.m., second 1,149, all 40 contacts neutralized. SM-60, SM-2, 6 remaining, held. ESSM, 4 remaining. RAM, 15. CIWS 4, 87%, aft, 81%. 7 fragment impacts starboard hull above waterline. No structural damage. Rogue wave, 43-degree roll, all systems operational within 21 seconds. Cost, $39.9 million. Time elapsed, 19 minutes. Running count, 3:49 a.m., second 1,149. All 40 contacts neutralized. SM-60, SM-2, 6 remaining. ESSM, 4 remaining. RAM, 15. CIWS 4, 87%, aft, 81%. 7 fragment impacts starboard hull. 2 crew minor injuries, rogue wave. Port side structural deformation logged. Cost, $56.4 million. Time, 19 minutes. The damage assessment at 5 a.m. compiled 2 separate pictures, the engagement damage and the rogue wave damage. Engagement damage. 7 fragment impacts above the starboard waterline from the CIWS AF close-range detonation, all cosmetic or minor structural. 1 fragment had struck the secondary satellite communication dome and cracked the dome housing. The communication system remained operational, but the dome housing required replacement before the ship entered any environment where seawater could enter the crack under pressure. No personnel injuries from the engagement. Rogue wave damage, more significant. The wave had struck the port side with sufficient force to cause structural deformation of 2 port side weather deck equipment mounts. Both mounts would require shipyard evaluation before they could carry equipment under rated load. 1 port side access hatch coaming had been deformed by the wave impact, requiring emergency repair to restore the hatch's weather seal. 3 stanchions on the port 01 level weather deck had been bent or sheared. Structural members, not load-bearing for the deck itself, but representing the force of a wave that had physically deformed steel. 2 crew members had sustained injuries during the rogue wave roll. 1 had been thrown against a bulkhead in the crew mess and sustained a fractured wrist. The other had been at a damaged control locker station and had sustained severe bruising to the left shoulder. Both were treated and placed on limited duty. The Rogue Wave had done more physical damage to the ship than the 40 combat platforms it had been defending against. The magazine assessment at 5:15 a.m., SM-6, 0 of 8. SM-2, 6 of 24 remaining. ESSM, 4 of 32 remaining. RAM, 15 of 21 remaining. CIWS forward, 87%. CIWS aft, 81%. The engagement had consumed 8 SM-6, 18 SM-2, 28 ESSM, and 6 RAM. Within the context of the Beaufort 9 weather degradations, this was a moderately efficient expenditure. The weather had cost approximately 4 to 6 additional interceptors in reduced hit probability compared to standard conditions, which matched prior Arctic engagement performance data. The Rogue Wave had not substantially altered the final interceptor count. Its primary effect had been the 21-second disruption and the one delayed/catch-up ESSM engagement, which had cost perhaps one additional round versus a no Rogue Wave baseline. The supply officer assembled the accounting at 7 a.m. 40 Shahed-136 one-way attack platforms at $20,000 each, $800,000. Launch logistics from assessed position northwest of the Aleutians, a submarine or surface platform that had transited into this remote sector to conduct the launch. $300,000 operational estimate. Total adversary investment, approximately $1.1 million. U.S. munitions expended, 8 SM-6 at $2.1 million to $16.8 million. 18 SM-2 at $1.2 million to $21.6 million. 28 ESSM at $450,000 to $12.6 million. 6 RAM at $900,000 to $5.4 million. CIWS, $28,000. Total, $56.4 million. Exchange ratio 51-1 in the adversary's favor. The ratio was in the standard range for a Beaufort 9 engagement. The weather penalties applied across all systems produced a higher round count per contact than standard conditions, which drove the exchange ratio above what a clear weather engagement would have produced. The difference from a theoretical clear weather engagement, approximately $8 to $12 million in additional interceptors attributable to the weather degradations. The Rogue Wave's financial impact was not in the interceptor count. It was in the structural damage. The portside equipment mounts, the hatch combing, the stanchions, the communication dome, assessed repair cost at the next scheduled port visit at $340,000. The 2 injured crew members, limited duty for 6 to 8 weeks for the wrist fracture, 3 to 4 weeks for the shoulder injury. None of those figures appeared in the exchange ratio. The exchange ratio covered interceptors against adversary platforms. It did not cover the North Pacific weather, which had cost $340,000 in structural repairs and 2 crew injuries without the adversary paying $1 for it. The after-action report's technical section documented the Rogue Wave effects with methodical precision. The 21-second CIWS forward downtime had been within the system's recovery envelope. The allocation restart after the 7-second monitor outage had caught the single unassigned contact within 4 seconds of the restart. The authorization interruption had been resolved within 27 seconds of the wave impact. All 3 effects had been managed within the engagement's available timeline. The technical section concluded, system performance under Rogue Wave conditions was within design tolerances. The engagement was successful. The human section, the TAO's personal notes appended to the formal record, added one observation that the technical section had not covered. The engagement had succeeded. The 21-second disruption had been managed. Contact 31 had been caught by the catch-up allocation. The weapons had functioned. The crew had recovered from the roll and continued the engagement without a break in weapons employment that lasted more than 27 seconds. The note. None of that had been practiced. The ship had trained for weather degradation in heavy seas. It had trained for equipment faults under combat conditions. It had never trained for a 43-degree roll while 6 interceptors were in flight and 2 were computing terminal engagement solutions. The recovery had been competent. It had also been, in the specific sequence that produced it, unprecedented. The ocean did not wait for the training calendar to address scenarios before deploying them. Emergency resupply transmitted at 6:44 a.m. SM-6 priority, SM-2 and ESSM secondary, ETA from the nearest logistics vessel, 5 days, weather dependent. Weather dependent. The same Beaufort 9 that had degraded the engagement, produced the rogue wave, and damaged the ship's portside equipment was also delaying the resupply by 2 additional days compared to the standard 4-day estimate. The logistics vessel was in the same weather system, 5 days. 6 SM, 2 and 4 ESSM remaining for outer and middle ring coverage. 15 RAM and CIWS at approximately 85% for inner ring coverage. In the North Pacific, in Beaufort 9, on a transit corridor that the adversary had just demonstrated they were monitoring. The 40 platforms had come from somewhere in the northwest. The launch platform, submarine or surface vessel, that had positioned them was still out there. Whether it was repositioning for a second launch, returning to port, or conducting other operations was not accessible. From the engagement data, the ship had 5 days to wonder. The weather would not moderate for another 2.